Hey guys, tonight we are sailing north, way north, past the warm middle of medieval Europe and up into the cold blue edge of the world, where the trees grow tall and the winters last forever, and a group of farmers, fishermen, and traders are about to spend 3 centuries quietly terrifying the rest of the continent. Tonight, you are going to the Viking Age. All of it. From the misty pre-Viking fjords where the first longship keels were being shaped in pine forests, to the moment in 1066 when the whole extraordinary chapter quietly closed and the Northmen became, in the end, just Europeans like everyone else. That is tonight's journey. It is long and cool and surprisingly cozy, and you will not have to row anything. Fair warning before we begin. Viking Age Scandinavia was not a soft place. It was cold for most of the year, dark for most of the winter, dependent on a short growing season that did not always cooperate, and populated by people who had developed a culture in which insulting someone's honour could escalate to a legal proceeding involving named witnesses and very precise compensation tables. If you were not strong, useful, and able to keep your opinions about your neighbours to yourself, life was complicated. You probably would not have done well in a feast hall, and you definitely would not have done well in a longship. But you will sleep through this just beautifully. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, if you feel like it, drop a comment with where you are in the world and what time it is as you listen. There is something genuinely lovely about knowing that someone in Reykjavik and someone in Buenos Aires and someone in a quiet flat in Glasgow are all drifting off to the same fjord tonight, to the same cold blue water that the Vikings themselves stood beside more than 1,000 years ago, looking out at the same horizon and wondering, possibly, what was on the other side. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing on the edge of a fjord, and the first thing you notice is the silence. Not the absence of sound, there is plenty of sound. The soft lap of cold water against rounded stones, the distant call of a seabird, the wind moving through pine branches with that particular hushed conversational quality that pine forests have everywhere, but the absence of human noise, the deep quiet of a landscape where there are no engines, no roads, no machinery, only the steady ambient music of weather and water and trees. The fjord stretches in front of you in a long blue-grey ribbon, its surface catching the pale northern light and giving it back almost unchanged. And on either side, the land rises in steep wooded slopes that climb toward distant ridges, still streaked with snow, even though the calendar insists it is summer. This is somewhere in southern Norway, around 750 CE, a few decades before the Viking Age officially begins, and the world you are looking at is the quiet prehistory of everything that is about to happen. The people who live here do not call themselves Vikings, that word will come later, and even then it will mean a specific activity rather than an ethnic identity. The way going on holiday is something you do rather than something you are. They are simply Northmen, Norsemen, the inhabitants of a region that the rest of Europe knows about vaguely and engages with rarely. Scandinavia in the 8th century is the medieval equivalent of a quiet neighbour who keeps to themselves. The rest of Europe will eventually wish they had stayed that way. The widely accepted historical fact worth settling into at the very beginning of tonight's journey is this. The Viking Age is conventionally dated from approximately 793 CE, the date of the famous raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne, which we will get to 1066 CE, the year of the Battle of Stamford Bridge and the Norman conquest of England, after which the Scandinavian world becomes increasingly indistinguishable from the broader European medieval world. That is roughly 273 years, almost 3 full centuries, during which a relatively small population from Scandinavia projected an extraordinary amount of influence across the entire known world, from the coast of North America to the markets of Baghdad. The Viking Age is short by historical standards. The Romans had longer dynasties, but pound for pound, in terms of geographic reach and cultural impact, very few civilizations have done as much with their 3 centuries. The lesser-known detail worth carrying into the night is that the word Viking itself is etymologically uncertain. The Old Norse word vik means a bay or inlet, and one popular theory holds that a Viking was simply someone who frequented bays, perhaps to load and unload trade goods, perhaps to wait in ambush, perhaps just to fish. Other theories connect the word to vika, an old unit of distance at sea, suggesting it referred to long-distance seafarers. The honest answer is that nobody is entirely sure, and the people we now call Vikings would not have used the word as a general identifier for themselves anyway. They were Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, members of specific communities and specific kindreds, and the unifying label was applied to them later by people who needed a shorthand for the complicated phenomenon of suddenly having a lot of Scandinavians in their territorial waters. You crouch at the edge of the fjord and let your fingers trail in the water. It is shockingly cold, the kind of cold that feels like a serious commitment from the water rather than a casual seasonal variation. And it smells of salt and pine resin, and that particular clean mineral quality, that very cold. Northern water has the smell of a substance that has not been warmed by anything in a long time and does not intend to be warmed anytime soon. Historians still wonder about the precise combination of factors that triggered the explosion of Viking activity at the end of the 8th century, population pressure in Scandinavia, climate improvement that opened up new agricultural and seafaring possibilities, the development of the technology that made the longship possible, political consolidation that created surplus warriors with no domestic outlet, the wealth of monasteries and trading towns making raiding economically rational. All of these probably contributed in proportions that the surviving evidence does not allow us to specify with confidence. A long, low pine-built hall sits on a small flat shelf of land above the fjord's edge, smoke rising from a hole in its turf roof in a thin grey line that goes straight up before the wind catches it and pulls it apart. Someone inside is cooking. The smell of it drifts down to where you are standing, mixing with the salt and the pine and the cold mineral water, becoming the smell of Scandinavia itself in 750 CE wood smoke and roasted meat, and the patient, unhurried preparation of dinner in a place where dinner is the central event of the evening because there is very little else to do. The world is quiet. It will not stay quiet much longer. The smell of dinner drifts down from the hall, and the fjord stays quiet, and the decades roll past in their slow northern way, sons inheriting fathers' farms, longships getting longer and faster as the shipwrights refine their craft. The steady accumulation of small technological and social changes that, taken together, constitute the kind of historical pressure that eventually has to express itself somewhere. By the late 8th century, the Scandinavian world has accumulated a population of farmers, fishermen, traders, and warriors whose ambitions are beginning to exceed what their fjord-fragmented homeland can comfortably provide, and they have, simultaneously, developed the maritime technology that allows them to do something about it. The longship is reaching its mature form. The crews are experienced. The trading networks have already established that there is significant wealth across the North Sea waiting to be acquired by purchase or by other means. The other means are about to become very fashionable. You are now off the northeast coast of England on the morning of June 8, 793 CE, and the small island ahead of you is Lindisfarne Holy Island, connected to the Northumbrian coast by a tidal causeway. that appears at low tide and disappears at high. The monastery that occupies the island has been there for over a century and a half, founded by Irish monks in 635 CE, and grown into one of the most important religious centres in Anglo-Saxon England. It contains a community of perhaps a few dozen monks, a chapel, a library with illuminated manuscripts of considerable beauty, and a treasury of liturgical objects in gold, silver, and gemstones that have been donated by generations of pious Northumbrian nobles. The monastery is wealthy. It is also, crucially, completely undefended, because the established conventions of early medieval European warfare did not generally include attacking monasteries, which were considered sacred even by Christians' enemies, and because the monastery has not yet been informed that the conventions are about to change without notice, the longships appear off the coast in the early light, and the monks who first see them probably do not understand immediately what they are looking at. Ships from the north, certainly, but ships from the north have been coming for trade for centuries. There is no obvious reason for alarm. The vessels approach the shore with the smooth efficiency of crews who have done this kind of beach landing many times before, drag their hulls up onto the gravel, and the men who jump out are armed and are not interested in trading. What follows is the event that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes with the kind of stunned brevity that suggests the chronicler was still working out what to make of it. The heathen miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. The widely accepted historical fact about the Lindisfarne raid is that it was almost certainly not the first Viking attack on the British Isles. There is evidence of earlier, smaller raids that did not enter the historical record as prominently, but it was the first that produced sufficient documentation, sufficient horror, and sufficient theological significance to register in the European consciousness as the beginning of something. The contemporary scholar Alcuin, an English monk working at the court of Charlemagne, wrote a series of agitated letters in the months after the raid, expressing the kind of cosmic confusion appropriate to someone who has just discovered that the world has new rules. He could not understand why God had permitted this, what the raiders signified theologically, or what was supposed to happen next. None of these questions had satisfying answers. The lesser-known detail about the Lindisfarne raid that tends to land with particular weight is that the Vikings did not just take valuables and leave, they took monks. The slave trade was a significant component of Viking economic activity throughout the period, and educated young men from monasteries, literate, multilingual, capable of managing accounts and correspondence, were valuable property. Some of the Lindisfarne community ended up in slave markets in Scandinavia, in Ireland, or further afield in the Mediterranean trade networks that the Vikings were already plugging themselves into. The fates of these specific individuals are mostly unrecorded, but their existence reframes the popular image of Viking raiding from a story primarily about violence to a story that includes a substantial component of human trafficking. Conducted with the same organized efficiency as the looting of the gold, you are watching the raid from the shore, present in that frictionless, observational way you have been present for everything tonight. And the chaos has the particular quality of a situation in which one party knows exactly what it is doing, and the other party has no preparation, no concept, and no plan. The monks who can run, run. The monks who cannot, do not. The longships are loaded methodically with whatever can be carried gold and silver objects from the chapel, illuminated manuscripts, livestock from the monastery's holdings, and the captives roped together for transport. The whole operation takes a few hours. By midday, the longships are pulling away from the gravel beach, their sails catching the sea breeze, and the monastery of Lindisfarne is on fire behind them. Historians still wonder about the precise psychological and economic calculations that produced the Viking decision to attack monasteries specifically. Some scholars argue that the raids were primarily economic monasteries, were simply the wealthiest and least defended targets available, and Viking raiders were operating on a straightforward cost-benefit analysis that did not include the religious significance of the sites. Others argue that there was a specifically anti-Christian element to the early raids, perhaps reflecting Scandinavian resentment of Christian missionary activity that had been pressing into Scandinavian territory for some time. The honest answer is probably that motivations varied between individual raiders and individual raids, and that the religious indifference of the raiders to Christian sacred space combined with the practical fact that those spaces contained portable wealth produced the pattern that the rest of Europe found so shocking. The Lindisfarne raid does not produce immediate large-scale invasion. It produces, instead, more raids at Jarrow the following year, at Iona in 795, and again in 802, and again in 806, at coastal targets up and down the British Isles, and along the European mainland. The gradual establishment of a pattern that confirms the Lindisfarne attack was not an isolated event, but the opening note of a long, sustained piece of music whose composer, the rest of Europe, is now urgently trying to identify. Word travels. Charlemagne's court hears about it. Monasteries on the European coast begin reluctant discussions about defensive measures. Coastal villages begin keeping watch. The medieval world adjusts itself, slowly and imperfectly, to a new fact. There is now something coming from the sea that did not used to come from the sea, and there is no obvious mechanism for making it stop. The longships are over the horizon by sunset, heading home. The smoke from Lindisfarne is visible from the mainland for days. The smoke clears eventually, the way smoke does, and the longships disappear back over the curve of the sea towards Scandinavia. And the next thing worth understanding tonight is the vessel that made all of this possible, because without the longship, the Viking Age does not happen. Not in the form it took, not at the scale it reached. The longship is the technology that enabled everything else, and you are about to spend some time aboard one, which is going to be cold and damp and considerably more athletic than the popular imagination tends to convey. You are now standing on a sloping beach somewhere on the Norwegian coast in the early 9th century, and the longship in front of you is being prepared for a North Sea crossing. It is, even just sitting on the gravel, a beautiful object, a long, low, elegant hull built of overlapping oak planks fastened together with iron rivets, its bow and stern curving upward in long, graceful lines that meet in carved terminations, sometimes shaped as dragons, sometimes as serpents, sometimes left plain, depending on the ship's purpose and the owner's budget. The hull is painted, often in bright colours that the sea will eventually fade reds and yellows, and the deep ochres and greens that Viking pigments could produce, and the shields of the crew are hung along the gunwales in alternating colours, a defensive arrangement and a piece of visual theatre simultaneously, because Viking material culture rarely missed an opportunity to combine the practical with the impressive. The widely accepted historical fact about Viking shipbuilding is that it represented one of the most sophisticated maritime engineering achievements of the early medieval world. The longship's specific innovations, the clinker-built hull with its overlapping planks, the long, flexible keel that allowed the ship to absorb the stresses of heavy seas without breaking, the symmetrical bow and stern that allowed the vessel to reverse direction without turning, the shallow draft that permitted both ocean voyages and river navigation, were the product of generations of refinement by Scandinavian shipwrights, working in a tradition that prized empirical knowledge transmitted through apprenticeship rather than written specification. The result was a vessel that could cross the open Atlantic in conditions that would sink most contemporary European ships, and could simultaneously be rowed up shallow rivers that were inaccessible to anything else of comparable size. You step aboard, and the deck, if deck is even the right word, for what is essentially a flat platform of loose pine boards, laid over the hull's transverse framing shifts, under your feet, with the kind of responsive movement that tells you, immediately, this is not a stable platform. Longships are designed to flex. The hull is meant to twist and adjust to the shape of the waves, distributing stress across the entire length of the vessel rather than resisting it at any one point. And the practical experience of standing aboard one is that everything moves slightly all the time. Your inner ear adjusts, your knees adjust. The Vikings, born to this, do not appear to notice. The crew is loading. There are perhaps 30 or 40 men aboard, depending on the size of the vessel and the nature of the voyage. And they are arranging themselves and their gear with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this many times. Each man has a sea chest, a wooden box containing his personal possessions, his weapons, his trading goods, his food rations that doubles as his rowing bench, which is one of those design solutions so elegant that it suggests the entire culture had been thinking about this problem for a very long time. You sit on a sea chest, you row from a sea chest. When you sleep, you stretch out beside your sea chest. The sea chest is your seat, your storage, your structural support, and your only personal space on a vessel that does not have a cabin or a private compartment of any kind. The lesser-known detail about life aboard a longship is how genuinely uncomfortable it was for extended voyages. The popular image of Vikings as masters of the sea sometimes obscures the reality that mastery did not include comfort. There was no shelter from the weather, what the rain did to you. The rain did to you, and there was no toilet. An absence whose practical management involved leaning over the gunwale with the assistance of one's neighbours and a degree of pragmatic dignity. There was no fire, because building a fire on a wooden ship was exactly the kind of decision that ended Viking voyages prematurely, which meant no hot food on long voyages, just dried meat, hard bread, salted fish, dried fruit, and water that sloshed around in barrels and developed a flavour that experienced sailors learned to ignore. The ship was wet. The men were wet. Everything inside the ship eventually became wet. A North Sea crossing in a longship was an experience whose romance is largely a function of the distance from which it is being viewed. The sail goes up a square sail of thick wool fabric, often woven by the women of the household over many months of patient work, dyed in stripes or solid colours and impregnated with animal fat to make it more wind-resistant, and the wind catches it, and the ship begins to move with that particular smooth acceleration that wind-powered vessels have when conditions are right. The shore recedes. The fjord opens out into the wider sea. The motion of the deck changes character as the ship leaves protected water and begins encountering the longer, more powerful swells of the open ocean. You are at sea now, and the experience is what the experience is. The wind is cold even in summer, sharp on your face, smelling of salt and the indefinable scent of distance. The ship rises and falls with the swells in long, slow cycles. The other men on board are doing whatever they need to do, adjusting the sail, checking the rigging, maintaining the ship's small practical economy with an air of professional calm that suggests this is, for them, simply the working environment. A man at the steering oar in the stern keeps the ship on its heading with small, precise corrections, watching the horizon and the sun and the patterns of the water with the attentive expression of someone whose job description has very little tolerance for distraction. Historians still wonder about the precise navigational techniques. The Vikings used to cross open water without modern instruments. Some combination of solar observation, knowledge of bird and marine life, observation of cloud patterns over distant land, and the use of a possible polarization-based device called a sunstone, mentioned in later sagas, and possibly identifiable with a type of crystal that can locate the sun on overcast days, appears to have given experienced Viking navigators the ability to make consistent ocean crossings. The exact methods are partially recovered through experimental archaeology and partially still a matter of informed speculation. The shore behind you is gone now. The horizon ahead is open water and pale northern sky, and you are aboard one of the most successful ships ever designed, moving across the cold blue distance toward whatever comes next, with 30 wet men, a bag of dried cod, and the wind doing exactly what wind is supposed to do. The wind keeps doing what wind is supposed to do, and the ship keeps doing what the ship was designed to do, and the men aboard settle into the long, attentive boredom that constitutes most of seafaring even today. Hours pass. The sun moves across the sky in its slow arc. The shoreline ahead remains a thin grey line that refuses to grow larger as quickly as you would like, which is one of the persistent psychological challenges of crossing the North Sea. The destination is always further away than it looks, because the air is so clear and the horizon is so distant that perspective becomes unreliable. You sit on your sea chest and watch the water move past the hull, and let your mind wander where it wants to wander, and where it wants to wander, eventually, is upward, up into the sky and beyond the sky, into the cosmology of the people who built this ship. Because the men around you, who are presently occupied with the practical business of getting to wherever they are going, carry inside their heads one of the most strange, beautiful, and structurally elaborate religious systems any human culture has ever produced. Norse mythology is dense in a way that very few religious traditions are dense. There are gods, there are giants, there are dwarves and elves and Norns and Valkyries and a world-encircling serpent and a wolf chained with a magical ribbon and a tree that holds the entire universe together with its roots, and a final apocalyptic battle that everyone knows is coming and that absolutely nobody is going to be able to prevent. You close your eyes against the sun, glare on the water, and the cosmology assembles itself behind your eyelids. At the centre of everything is Yggdrasil the World Tree, an enormous ash whose roots and branches structure the universe into 9 distinct worlds connected through its trunk. Asgard, the realm of the Aesir gods, is at the top. Midgard, the world of humans, sits in the middle. Helheim, the realm of the dead who did not die in battle, lies somewhere below. There are realms of giants, of fire, of ice, of light elves and dark elves, all arranged in a vertical cosmology that makes the universe feel less like a single space and more like a multi-story building with very specific zoning. The widely accepted historical fact about Norse mythology that bears settling into is that nearly everything we know about it comes from sources written down after Scandinavia had been Christianized. The Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, both compiled in 13th century Iceland, primarily by a Christian Icelander named Snorri Sturluson, who appears to have had a genuine scholarly affection for the old stories and made considerable effort to record them faithfully. This means that almost the entire corpus of Norse mythology, as we have it, was filtered through Christian sensibilities, written down centuries after the religion had ceased to be actively practiced, and probably represents a particular literary and aesthetic shaping of what was once a much more diverse and locally varied set of beliefs and practices. The Vikings themselves, during the actual Viking Age, did not write their religion down. They told it. Odin is the chief of the Aesir gods, one-eyed, wandering, complicated, the god of wisdom, war, poetry, and death, who hung himself on Yggdrasil for 9 nights to gain the secret of the runes, and who pays for his knowledge in a constant currency of personal sacrifice that makes him simultaneously the most powerful and the least cheerful figure in the follow. Pantheon. Thor is his son, red-bearded, immensely strong, hammer-wielding, the god of thunder and storms, and the protector of both gods and humans against the giants who would otherwise overrun everything. Freya is the great goddess of love, beauty, war, and death. Yes, all of those simultaneously, because Norse divine portfolios were not organized according to the principle that everyone should specialize. Loki is complicated. Loki is the trickster, the shape changer, the constant source of trouble, who is also, frequently, the god who solves the problems he created, until eventually he creates problems he cannot solve, and the whole arrangement comes apart at Ragnarök. The lesser-known detail about Viking religion that tends to genuinely surprise people is how integrated it was with daily life. There were no professional priests in the Viking Age, no clerical class equivalent to Christian priests or Roman augurs. Religious functions were performed by chieftains, by the heads of households, by women in specific contexts, by individuals who had relationships with particular gods. Worship happened at home shrines, at sacred groves and springs in the landscape, at temples that doubled as community gathering places, at major festivals that combined religious observance with feasting and political assembly. The relationship between humans and gods was personal and reciprocal. You made offerings, the gods provided protection or success. The obligation ran in both directions. If a god failed to provide what was promised, the relationship could be terminated, and there are recorded instances of Viking Age individuals announcing that they were finished with a particular god who had not held up their end of the arrangement. Then there is Ragnarök, which deserves its full, uncomfortable moment in any account of Norse religion. The Norse believed, with apparent seriousness, that the world was going to end, and not in some vague, distant theological future, but in a specific apocalyptic battle in which the gods themselves would die. Odin would be devoured by the wolf Fenrir. Thor would kill the world serpent Jörmungandr and then die from its venom. The sun would be eaten, the stars would fall, the world would burn, and then sink beneath the sea. A small remnant of gods and humans would survive to repopulate a renewed world, but the gods you knew and the world you lived in would be gone permanently. This was not a metaphor or a moral teaching, it was, by the available evidence, taken as straightforward cosmological prediction. The Vikings believed in their religion, and their religion told them that everything they cared about was eventually going to lose. You open your eyes, and the men around you are still doing their work, still adjusting the sail, still watching the horizon, still occupying themselves with the small, practical business of being aboard a ship at sea. They believe their world is going to end. They believe their gods are going to die. They believe this is built into the fundamental structure of reality, and they are, on the available evidence, completely fine with it. Historians still wonder about the psychological effect of Ragnarök belief on Viking Age behavior, particularly the question of whether the conviction that everything was eventually doomed contributed to the willingness to take enormous risks. If the world is going to end anyway, if the gods themselves cannot prevent their own destruction, then perhaps the appropriate human response is to live courageously, act decisively, accept your eventual death with composure, and not waste time worrying about a future that the gods themselves cannot guarantee. This is a productive theological framework for raiders, settlers, and long-distance voyagers. It does not, however, lend itself to an excessively cautious approach to risk management. The horizon ahead is closer now. The shoreline is taking on detail. Whatever the men aboard this ship are about to do when they reach it, they are not going to be paralyzed by anxiety about the long-term consequences. That is, after all, somebody else's problem. The shoreline takes on detail, and the longship slides closer to whatever destination it has chosen. And you watch the men aboard prepare for landing with the same practiced efficiency they brought to every other phase of the voyage, and then, with the small narrative magic that has been moving you through this journey, the scene shifts. The ship and the sea and the cosmology fade behind you, and you find yourself somewhere quieter, somewhere lower to the ground, somewhere that smells of wood smoke and animals and damp wool. Because for every Viking who set out on a longship, there were many more who never left the farm. Most of the people in Viking Age Scandinavia were not raiders. Most of them were farmers, and the farm was the actual centre of Viking Age life, the institution around which the entire culture was organised. You are now standing in the doorway of a Viking longhouse on a Norwegian farm in the early 9th century, and the building in front of you is the heart of an entire household's existence. It is long and low, perhaps 20 metres from end to end, built of timber framing with walls of vertical wooden planks and a roof of overlapping wooden shingles, or sometimes thick layers of turf, actual sod cut from the earth, laid grass side up, providing remarkable insulation, and the visually striking feature of a building whose roof is alive with grass and wildflowers in the warm months. The roof slopes steeply down toward the eaves, and the whole structure has the squat, settled appearance of architecture that has been refined over many generations to deal with very specific problems: keeping out cold, keeping in warmth, surviving heavy snowfall, and using only the materials available locally to a culture without easy access to stone construction. Inside, the longhouse is one big room. There are no internal walls separating different functions or different family members. The space is organised longitudinally, a central hearth running down the middle of the floor, the smoke rising through a hole in the roof above it, the sleeping platforms running along the walls on both sides, the work areas arranged at one end, and the livestock often housed at the other end of the same building, separated only by a low wooden partition. This last detail tends to surprise people who have not encountered it before. The family and their animals shared the same building. The cows and goats had their stalls under the same roof as the humans, contributing their body heat to the building's warmth in winter and providing a constant ambient backdrop of animal sounds and smells that the humans simply incorporated into the texture of daily life. The widely accepted historical fact about Viking Age daily life that often gets lost in the more dramatic narratives is that Scandinavia in this period was overwhelmingly rural and agricultural. The vast majority of the population lived on farms like this one, growing barley and oats and rye, raising sheep and cattle and pigs and goats, supplementing their diet with fish from nearby waters and game from the surrounding forest, producing nearly everything they consumed within the household economy. Trading towns existed Hedeby in southern Denmark, Birka in Sweden, Kaupang in Norway. But these were small, even by medieval European standards, and they served a population that was fundamentally agrarian. The famous Vikings of legend, the raiders and explorers and conquerors, came from this farming base. Most years they were not raiding. Most years they were home, working the farm, and the raids that made it into the historical record were, for most of the men involved, summer activities undertaken between agricultural seasons. You step inside, and the interior is darker than you expected. There are small windows cut into the walls, but they are few and small, sealed with stretched animal membrane rather than glass, admitting only a soft, diffused light. The hearth fire provides the main illumination, and the smoke from it has stained everything inside the building, a deep amber brown, over years of accumulated soot, giving the longhouse a warm, dim atmosphere that feels simultaneously cozy and slightly suffocating, depending on your tolerance for indoor air quality. The floor is packed earth, swept clean. The sleeping platforms along the walls are covered with woolen blankets and furs, and the occasional luxury of an imported piece of textile from the southern trade networks. Tools hang from pegs on the wall posts. A loom stands at one end of the building, half-finished cloth stretched on its vertical frame. The loom waits small carved stones hanging at the bottom, keeping tension on the warp threads. The lesser-known detail about Viking Age domestic life is the legal sophistication of the household economy. The household was not just a residence. It was a legal unit with specific rights and responsibilities, governed by laws that addressed everything from the obligations of servants to the inheritance rights of children to the legal status of livestock. The keys to the household, actual physical keys to the storage chests where valuables were kept, were carried by the woman of the household as a marker of her authority, and the legal codes recognized the housewife's domain as a sphere of genuine jurisdiction within which the husband's authority was limited. A wife who was struck by her husband had legal recourse. A wife who was insulted publicly could initiate proceedings. The household was a legal partnership, however asymmetrical in other respects, and the laws governing it were taken seriously. The day on a Viking farm runs from before dawn to after dark, structured by the absolute requirements of agricultural work and animal care. Cows must be milked, sheep must be tended, fields must be ploughed in spring, weeded in summer, harvested in fall. Firewood must be cut, split and stacked. Tools must be repaired. Cloth must be woven. Garments must be sewn and mended. Food must be preserved for winter meat smoked and salted. Fish dried, dairy products turned into the long-lasting forms of cheese and butter that will see the household through the dark months. The work is constant, demanding and unrelenting, and the social organization of the household adults, children, servants, slaves is structured around the distribution of these constant demands. Historians still wonder about the precise nature of slavery in Viking Age Scandinavia, specifically the proportion of the population that was enslaved, the conditions under which they lived, and the mechanisms by which slaves could, in some cases, purchase or earn their freedom. The Old Norse word thrall referred to enslaved persons who appear in the legal codes and the sagas as a recognized social category with limited but real legal standing. They worked alongside free household members in many tasks, lived in the same buildings, and in some cases married into free families and produced descendants who eventually became free. The ethical implications of Viking Age slavery do not improve on examination, but the institutional details are more complicated than the simple categories of free and enslaved tend to suggest. A pot is simmering over the hearth, and someone has been baking flat barley bread on a heated stone, and the combined smell of these things, bread, broth, wood smoke, animals, drying herbs hanging from the rafters, is the actual smell of the Viking Age, the ambient background against which everything else happened. It is, surprisingly, a comforting smell. Section 6. The smell of bread and broth and wood smoke settles into the dim, warm air of the longhouse, and you find yourself drawn deeper into the room, past the hearth, toward the end of the building where the loom stands against the wall, and the work that produces most of what this household needs to wear, sleep under, and trade with is being conducted by the women whose authority over this domain is, by the law and the custom of the period, considerable. Because if you want to understand Viking Age society, you cannot stop at the longships and the raids and the warriors. You have to walk to the loom. You have to sit down beside it. You have to spend some time with the women who ran the household economy, governed the domestic sphere, and produced through generations of patient, skilled work much of the wealth that made the entire Viking Age possible. The woman at the loom is the mistress of this household, and she carries the keys. The keys are not metaphorical. She wears them on a chain at her waist, a small ring of iron keys that open the storage chests where the household's valuables are kept, the silver, the imported textiles, the goods accumulated through trade or raid or careful saving. The keys are a symbol, but they are also literally functional, and the woman who holds them has the legal and practical authority to open or close the household's resources at her discretion. When her husband is away at sea, at the assembly, at war, at the harvest market, she runs the farm, manages the workers, makes the economic decisions, conducts the trades, and represents the household in any matter that arises in his absence. which, in a culture where significant numbers of men were away from home for extended periods, was very often. The widely accepted historical fact about women in Viking Age society is that they enjoyed a degree of legal status and personal freedom that was, by the standards of contemporary medieval Europe, notably extensive. Viking Age women could own property in their own names, inherit from their parents, conduct business transactions, divorce their husbands for specific causes, including impotence and physical abuse, and serve as witnesses in legal proceedings. A woman who was widowed with property became, in effect, the legal head of her household, and could remain unmarried indefinitely if she chose without losing her standing. The legal codes recognized women as persons, rather than as the property of their fathers or husbands. A status that, while still falling well short of any modern conception of gender equality, was significantly more substantial than what most European Christian societies of the period offered to women. You are watching the loom now, and the work happening on it is genuinely impressive. The loom is upright, a vertical wooden frame leaning against the wall, and the warp threads hang down from a beam at the top, weighted at the bottom by the row of carved stone weights that keep them under tension. The weaver, the household's mistress, working alongside one of her daughters and a young female servant, moves the weft thread through the warp using a wooden shuttle, packing each row of weft tight with a long-handled wooden beater. The fabric grows downward as the work proceeds, slowly accumulating into the wool cloth that will eventually be cut and sewn into clothing, sails, blankets, and the various other textile products that the household needs and produces in significant quantities. The lesser-known detail about Viking Age textile production that consistently surprises people is the sheer scale of what was being produced. A single sail for a longship required something like 100 square meters of woven wool fabric, treated with animal fat to make it weather-resistant, and represented several years of skilled labor by experienced weavers. The Viking expansion was, in a very real sense, made possible by Viking textile production without sails, no longships, without longships, no raids, and no settlement. Without women weaving for years to produce each individual sail, no Viking Age. The ships get the credit in the popular imagination, but the ships were impossible without the looms, and the looms were operated almost exclusively by women. The story of the Viking Age, properly told, is as much a story about textile production as about anything else. Beyond the household weavers, Viking Age women occupied a range of social roles that the popular imagination has, in recent decades, begun to acknowledge with appropriate seriousness. The shield maiden, the female warrior, appears in the sagas with sufficient frequency and specificity that scholars have moved from skepticism to cautious acceptance that some Viking Age women did, in fact, fight. Archaeological evidence has supported this in specific cases, including the famous Birka warrior grave in Sweden, which contained a complete warrior's burial assemblage and was, after DNA analysis in the 21st century, conclusively identified as the grave of a woman. How common female warriors actually were in practice, as opposed to in literature, remains debated, but the question is no longer whether they existed at all. Then there are the Vola, the seers, the wise women, the practitioners of Seether, the form of Norse magic associated specifically with prophecy and the manipulation of fate. The vulva travelled between communities, performed her rituals at the request of households or chieftains, predicted the futures of individuals and seasons, communicated with spirits, and held a position of religious and social authority that operated outside the normal household structure. Odin himself, in the mythology, practices Seether, but it is associated primarily with women, and the men who practiced it were sometimes regarded with suspicion. The vulva represented a category of female power that was specifically recognized as belonging to women, and that did not have a clear male equivalent. Historians still wonder about the precise relationship between the elevated legal status of Viking Age women and the broader social structure that produced it. The conventional explanation has focused on the practical realities of long absences by men. When significant portions of the male population are away for months at a time, women must be able to manage farms, businesses, and households independently, and the legal system tends to develop in ways that support this practical necessity. But other factors may have contributed. The relatively decentralized political structure of Viking Age society, the importance of household alliances in a kinship-based legal system, the influence of pre-Christian religious frameworks that included powerful goddesses, and patterns of inheritance that distributed property across genders. The combination produced something distinctive without producing an explicit ideology of gender equality, which is a useful reminder that the conditions of women's lives in any society reflect a complex of economic, legal, religious, and demographic factors rather than any single cause. The mistress of the household pauses her weaving to check the progress of the daughter beside her, makes a small correction with the patient expression of someone who has been teaching this same skill for a long time, and resumes her own work without speaking. Outside, the wind picks up across the fjord. Inside, the loom keeps going. The loom keeps going, and the wool keeps growing into fabric, and the fabric will eventually become a sail, and the sail will eventually catch the wind, and the wind will eventually carry a longship across water towards somewhere new, and where that somewhere is, and what happens when the ship arrives, depends on calculations more complicated than the popular image of Viking activity tends to acknowledge. Because here is the thing about the Viking expansion that often gets simplified into a single dramatic narrative. It was not just raiding, it was not just trading, it was not just settling. It was all of these things, often simultaneously, often performed by the same individuals during the same voyage, with the choice between violence and commerce frequently determined by what the Vikings encountered when they arrived, rather than by what they had decided in advance. You are now back on the deck of a longship, but it is a different kind of voyage from the one to Lindisfarne. The crew aboard this vessel has not made up its mind about what kind of trip this is going to be, and the cargo hold reflects this strategic flexibility. There are weapons aboard, certainly swords, axes, shields, the standard kit of a Viking Age fighting man, but there is also trade goods, bundles of furs from the northern forests, walrus ivory from the Arctic margins, amber from the Baltic shores, fine woolen textiles, iron tools, and a small but valuable consignment of slaves acquired on a previous voyage. The ship is a multi-purpose vessel of a multi-purpose age, and the men aboard are merchants, if circumstances favour commerce, and raiders, if circumstances favour violence, and quite possibly both during the same voyage, if circumstances favour doing one in one place and the other in another. The widely accepted historical fact about the Viking expansion is that it operated through multiple parallel mechanisms across an enormous geographic range. Norwegian Vikings tended westward to the Faroes, Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America, but also to Ireland, the Hebrides, the Orkneys, and the western coast of Scotland. Danish Vikings focused on England and the European mainland, the coasts of France, the Frisian trading centres, the rivers leading inland into Frankish territory. Swedish Vikings turned eastward into the Baltic, then up the great rivers of Eastern Europe, eventually reaching the Black Sea, the Caspian, Constantinople, and Baghdad. The geographic reach is genuinely staggering when you map it, from the Newfoundland coast of North America to the Volga River, with significant established presence at points along the entire span, and the activity at each of these locations was not uniform. In Ireland, Vikings established trading towns Dublin, Limerick, Waterford, Wexford, Cork that served as bases for both raiding and commerce. In England, Vikings raided heavily in the early 9th century and then began settling and intermarrying with the local Anglo-Saxon population. In the Frankish kingdom, Vikings extracted enormous tribute payments from kings, who calculated that paying them off was cheaper than fighting them, until the Frankish kings ran out of money and had to fight them anyway. In the eastern Mediterranean, the Vikings became enormously successful merchants, dealing in furs, slaves, and northern luxury goods, in exchange for the silver coinage that flooded back into Scandinavia and shows up in archaeological hoards across the Viking world. The lesser-known detail about Viking economic activity that consistently surprises people is the scale of the silver trade. Archaeological excavations across Scandinavia have produced enormous quantities of silver coins, ingots, and hack silver, that is, silver objects that have been deliberately cut into pieces for use as bullion. The single largest source of this silver was not raiding but trade, specifically the long-distance trade with the Islamic world conducted through the Eastern European river systems. Coins from the Abbasid Caliphate, Samarkand, Baghdad. The trading cities of Central Asia turn up in Viking Age hordes in Sweden in such numbers that they constitute the most direct material evidence of Viking Age commercial reach. The Vikings sold furs and slaves to the Islamic markets of the East, and bought, with the proceeds, the silver that financed everything they did at home, including the construction of the longships that allowed them to keep going east in the first place. The economic system was, in its way, beautifully circular. You watch the crew negotiate among themselves about the next destination. The conversation is conducted in the calm, deliberative manner of people who have done this many times and understand that the decision affects everyone aboard. Someone mentions a coastal monastery that was reportedly hit 2 summers ago and might have recovered enough to be worth visiting again. Someone else suggests a trading port further south where they have established relationships and could probably offload the furs at a good price. A third opinion holds out for a different location entirely, citing intelligence about a recent harvest failure that would suggest depleted defences but also depleted wealth, which would not be ideal. The discussion moves through these options with the structured pragmatism of a small business meeting, which is exactly what it is. The slaves aboard the ship sit in the bow, roped together, occasionally fed, treated as cargo because they are cargo. Their existence is one of the genuine moral horrors of the period, and not one that the popular romantic vision of the Vikings tends to dwell on with appropriate clarity. The Viking trade in human beings was substantial, persistent, and economically significant captives taken in raids, captives purchased from other slave dealers, captives traded for silver and goods at the major markets of the period, and the people involved in this trade did not appear to have struggled with it morally in any documented way. The institution was simply there. The economy required it. The transactions proceeded. Historians still wonder about the precise scale of the Viking slave trade in proportional terms, particularly in relation to the contemporary slave trades being conducted by Arab merchants, Byzantine merchants, and various European powers. The evidence is fragmentary, and the surviving records are skewed toward particular routes and particular periods, which makes systematic estimation difficult. What is clear is that the trade was significant enough to be a major component of the Viking economy, and to leave traces in the archaeological record across the entire Viking world, including in the genetic legacy of populations in regions where Viking Age slave-taking was particularly intense. The decision is made. The crew adjusts the sail. The ship turns slightly to port and settles onto a new heading, and the men aboard return to whatever they were doing, checking equipment, eating dried cod, dozing on their sea chests. Some of them are about to commit acts of violence against people who do not yet know they are coming. Some of them are about to conduct routine commercial transactions that would be unremarkable in any era. Most of them, on balance, will go home with enough silver to buy another year of better life on their farms. The ship moves forward across the cold blue water, and the men aboard are neither heroes nor monsters, but something more difficult. Ordinary people pursuing ordinary economic interests through a wide variety of means. In a culture that had not yet decided that some of those means were unacceptable, the wind, as always, is indifferent. The wind stays indifferent, and the ship keeps moving, and the choices made on its deck multiply across hundreds of similar decks, across decades of similar voyages, until sometime around the middle of the 9th century, a shift occurs in the pattern of Viking activity in England that the people on the receiving end have considerable difficulty failing to notice. The raids have been continuous since Lindisfarne, sometimes intensifying, sometimes easing, but always essentially the same kind of event. Ships arrive, take what they can, and leave. Then, in 865 CE, the ships arrive and do not leave. Not that summer, not that fall, not that winter. The Vikings have decided that England is no longer a place to visit. England is a place to acquire. And the operation that arrives in East Anglia in 865 CE is something the chroniclers of the period struggle to find precise words for, and eventually settle on calling the Great Heathen Army. You are now on a beach in East Anglia. In late summer 865 CE, and the scale of what is being unloaded onto the gravel is genuinely different from what you have seen before. The Viking expeditions of the previous decades were typically counted in single ships or small flotillas, perhaps a few hundred men at most. The force coming ashore now is something else. Dozens of ships, thousands of warriors, supply ships carrying provisions for a long stay, horses being led carefully down ramps from specialized transport vessels, the organized infrastructure of a campaign rather than a raid. The Vikings have, somewhere in the preceding years, decided that incremental looting is no longer the optimal strategy and have committed themselves to something considerably more ambitious. The widely accepted historical fact about the Great Heathen Army is that it represented the most coordinated and large-scale Viking operation of the entire period up to that point, and that its leadership was composed of figures whose names entered both Anglo-Saxon chronicle history and Norse saga literature with equal prominence. The army was reportedly led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, Ubba, and possibly others depending on which source you consult, who, according to the saga tradition, were avenging their father's death at the hands of the Northumbrian king Ella, who had supposedly thrown Ragnar into a snake pit. Whether the saga tradition reflects historical reality or is a literary elaboration of more prosaic political motivations is one of those questions where the romantic version is more entertaining and the prosaic version is probably more accurate, and you can pick whichever appeals to you for sleep purposes. The army winters in East Anglia, demanding and receiving food and horses from the local King Edmund, and then begins moving systematically through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms with the methodical thoroughness of a force that has all the time in the world and considerable strategic patience. Northumbria falls in 866 CE. The great city of York is captured, and the Northumbrian royal family, including the unfortunate King Ella, meets the kind of end that makes the saga writers sit up and pay attention. Mercia is forced to make terms in 868 CE. East Anglia is fully conquered in 869 CE, with King Edmund killed in circumstances that subsequent Christian tradition will elaborate into a martyrdom complete with a wolf guarding his severed head, which is one of those medieval hagiographical details that demonstrates how completely the lines between historical event and theological narrative could blur in the period. By the early 870s, 3 of the 4 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, are under Viking control. Only Wessex remains, and Wessex is governed by a young king who has just inherited the throne under the worst possible circumstances, and who does not look on first inspection, like he is going to be the man who saves Anglo-Saxon civilization. His name is Alfred. The lesser-known detail about the great heathen army that consistently surprises people is the degree to which the Viking conquest of much of England was followed by genuine settlement rather than just political domination. The areas under Viking control became known collectively as the Danelaw, the region governed by Danish law rather than Anglo-Saxon law, and they did not simply have a Viking ruling class superimposed on an Anglo-Saxon population. They were settled by significant numbers of Scandinavian immigrants who arrived in the wake of the conquest, established farms, married into local communities, and produced a distinctive Anglo-Scandinavian regional culture whose linguistic and legal traces are still visible in northern and eastern England today. The place names of the Danelaw are recognisably Norse, anything ending in by, Thorpe, Toft. Thwaite carries Scandinavian roots, and the dialect of English spoken in these regions absorbed substantial vocabulary from Old Norse that subsequently spread into the standard language. Words you use every day in modern English: sky, window, knife, husband, egg, leg, them, they. There entered the language through Anglo-Scandinavian contact during this period. The conquest is not complete, however, because Wessex is not falling. Alfred, in the spring of 878 CE, is forced into a famous winter retreat into the marshes of Somerset, the period traditionally associated with the equally famous and almost certainly legendary story of Alfred burning the cakes while distracted by his priest. Strategic planning, which is the kind of humanizing anecdote that medieval English chroniclers added to royal biographies to make their subjects more relatable. From his marshland refuge, Alfred rebuilds his forces, returns to the field at the Battle of Edington in May 878 CE, and decisively defeats the Viking leader Guthrum, who agrees as part of the subsequent peace settlement to convert to Christianity and to govern the territory under a formal treaty that establishes the boundary between Anglo-Saxon and Viking-controlled England. You are watching the aftermath of Edington, the surrender of Guthrum, the subsequent baptism, the division of England into the territory Alfred would rule and the territory the Vikings would rule. The atmosphere is not one of decisive triumph. It is one of pragmatic accommodation between two parties who have each discovered that they cannot fully defeat the other and have decided that a stable boundary is preferable to continued exhausting warfare. This is the realistic texture of how most medieval conflicts actually ended, not with one side annihilated and the other side victorious, but with both sides agreeing to stop fighting under terms that allowed each to claim something they could call success. Historians still wonder about the actual size of the great heathen army, which is one of those numerical questions that medieval sources tend to handle with creative imprecision. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle does not give specific figures, and modern estimates range from a few thousand warriors to upwards of 10,000 depending on which interpretive framework is applied. The lower estimates are probably closer to reality, but even a force of 2,000 or 3,000 professional warriors operating in disciplined units would have been overwhelming against the part-time militias that constituted the main military forces of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Alfred returns to his rebuilt court at Winchester. Guthrum returns to his territory in East Anglia, now ruling as a baptized Christian king with a Frankish-style royal name added to his Norse one. The boundary holds, more or less, for several decades, and the long process by which Viking England would gradually be reabsorbed into a unified English kingdom under Alfred's descendants begins. The smoke from 100 burned monasteries hangs over the country. The Vikings, however, are no longer just visiting. The Vikings are not just visiting England, and the Vikings are not just visiting many other places either. And somewhere in the same decades, when the great heathen army is settling into the Danelaw and Alfred is rebuilding his Wessex defences, a different kind of Viking voyage is heading in a different direction, entirely westward, into open ocean, toward an island that nobody currently lives on and that very few people even know exists. The smoke from the burned monasteries hangs over England, but the wind that carries that smoke is the same wind that fills the sails of ships heading the other way, into the cold, blank water of the North Atlantic, looking for somewhere to start over. You are now aboard a different longship, on a longer voyage, and the men around you are not raiders. They are settlers, entire families packed aboard, with their livestock secured in the hold, their tools and seed grain and household goods carefully stowed, their wives and children sitting beside them on the sea chests, with the patient endurance of people who have committed to a journey they know is going to take much longer than is comfortable. There are sheep in the cargo hold. There are chickens in wooden cages. There is a milk cow whose presence aboard the ship represents a logistical achievement of considerable complexity. The Vikings are not just exporting violence. They are exporting their entire civilization, packed into ships, heading west to find somewhere to put it. The destination is Iceland, and you arrive there in the late 9th century, along with the wave of Norse settlers who, between roughly 870 and 930 CE, will populate an empty volcanic island in the middle of the North Atlantic, with families from Norway, the Hebrides, and the other Scandinavian colonies in the British Isles. Iceland, in 870 CE, is not entirely uninhabited. There is some evidence of small communities of Irish monks who had reached the island earlier, seeking the kind of solitude that is much easier to find on a remote North Atlantic island than in mainland Europe, but the monks either left or were displaced by the Norse settlement, and within a few decades of the first organised Viking landings, the island has a substantial Scandinavian population, establishing farms across the habitable coastal areas. The widely accepted historical fact about the Norse settlement of Iceland is that it produced one of the most distinctive political experiments of the early medieval world. By 930 CE, the Icelandic settlers had established the Althing, an annual assembly held at a specific location in southwestern Iceland called Thingvellir, where the chieftains and free men of the island gathered for 2 weeks every summer to make laws, hear court cases, conduct trade, arrange marriages, and manage the collective affairs of the community. The Althing functioned without a king. It was a republic of sorts, not in any modern democratic sense, since participation was restricted to free men of substance, but a government by collective assembly rather than by hereditary monarchy. The Althing, in some institutional form or another, has continued to function from 930 CE to the present day, making it the oldest continuously operating parliamentary institution in the world. You are at Thingvellir during the Althing of one of the early years of the assembly, and the location alone is worth describing for sleep purposes because it is one of the most geologically dramatic landscapes anywhere on Earth. Thingvellir sits in the Rift Valley, where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates are pulling apart, producing a long, flat valley floor, flanked by sheer cliffs of dark basalt and crossed by clear rivers running over volcanic rock. The Icelandic settlers, with the directness that characterized their culture, looked at this naturally amphitheatrical landscape and decided it was the appropriate place to conduct their national affairs. The law speaker, the official whose job it was to recite the entire body of Icelandic law from memory over the course of the assembly, stood on a platform of rock at the foot of one of the cliffs, and his voice carried across the valley with a natural acoustic that the Icelanders treated as confirmation that this was, in fact, the right venue. The lesser-known detail about the Icelandic experiment that consistently surprises people is the extraordinary literary output it produced over the following centuries. Iceland, in the medieval period, small, remote, sparsely populated, harsh, became one of the great literary cultures of medieval Europe, producing the saga literature that constitutes our most extensive surviving body of medieval Scandinavian writing. The saga's long prose narratives recounting the lives of early settlers, the feuds between leading families, the voyages to distant lands were written down in Iceland in the 12th and 13th centuries, drawing on oral traditions that had been preserved across generations of dark winter evenings spent telling stories around the longhouse hearths. They are extraordinary documents, simultaneously historical sources and works of literature, and they preserve a picture of Viking Age life that no other medieval European literature comes close to providing. Greenland comes next. In the late 10th century, an Icelandic farmer named Eric the Red is exiled from Iceland for 3 years. Following a particularly serious feud, Icelandic society took its disputes seriously and addressed them through formal legal proceedings that could result in outlawry, and decides to spend his exile exploring the rumoured land to the west. He finds it, a much larger island even than Iceland, with habitable fjords along its southwestern coast, glacier-covered interior, and the kind of marginal but workable agricultural land that could support a Norse settlement if you were prepared to work hard and stay focused. He returns to Iceland after his exile and conducts what may be the most successful real estate marketing campaign in early medieval history, naming the island Greenland, a deliberately appealing name, chosen, he reportedly explained, because people would be more inclined to settle in a place with an attractive name. This is, by the available evidence, the original recorded instance of branding. You sail with Eric's expedition to Greenland in 985 CE, and the settlements that take root in the southwestern fjords represent one of the most extreme experiments in Norse expansion agriculture, pushed to its absolute climatic limit. In a landscape where the growing season is brief, the winters are severe, and the connection to the rest of the Norse world depends on annual ship visits across notoriously difficult ocean. The Greenland colonies will survive for nearly 500 years before climatic deterioration, isolation, and the practical difficulty of maintaining agricultural civilization on the edge of habitable space eventually overcomes the settlers' persistence. But for those 500 years, there is a Norse society in Greenland, farms, churches, a bishop, a small but functional connection to the broader European world, and from those Greenland settlements, the next step westward becomes possible. Historians still wonder about the precise mechanisms by which the Greenland colonies eventually failed in the 15th century, and whether the failure was primarily climatic, demographic, economic, or some combination of factors that no single explanation can fully capture. The end of Norse Greenland was gradual, last contact with Iceland in the early 15th century, the colonies fading into silence over subsequent decades, and it remains one of medieval Europe's quiet, unresolved closures. But that is centuries ahead. For now, in 985 CE, the colonies are alive, the farms are producing, and a son of Eric the Red is about to make his own contribution to the family tradition of westward exploration. His name is Leif. His name is Leif Erikson, and he is, by the available evidence, exactly the kind of person you would expect to be born to Eric the Red. Curious, capable, willing to take significant risks on the basis of relatively limited information, and possessed of the family talent for being in the right place at the right time to make history without necessarily intending to. He grows up in Greenland in the late 10th century, learning the practical skills of a Norse settler in a marginal environment, sailing, navigation, livestock management, the kind of pragmatic competence that the Greenland conditions demanded as a baseline requirement for survival, and by his early adulthood, he has the experience and the resources to organize an expedition of his own. The motivation for the expedition comes from someone else. A merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson, sailing from Iceland to Greenland a few years earlier, had been blown off course by storms and had drifted southwest for several days before finally correcting his heading and reaching Greenland. During those days of unintentional drift, Bjarni had sighted land, a wooded coastline he had not recognized, lying further west than any Norse explorer had previously documented. He had not landed. He had simply observed the coast, made a note of its existence, and continued on to Greenland to deliver his cargo, which is, depending on your perspective, either an admirable demonstration of professional focus or one of the great missed opportunities in the history of exploration. Leif decides that the unknown coast Bjarni had seen is worth investigating. He buys Bjarni's ship, apparently believing the vessel itself might carry some kind of navigational luck, assembles a crew of approximately 35 men, and sets out from Greenland sometime around the year 1000 CE, heading west and south, into water that no Norse expedition had deliberately explored before. You are aboard Leif's ship now, and the journey unfolds in stages that the saga literature records with a precision that has allowed modern scholars to identify the lands he encountered with reasonable confidence. The first landfall is a barren rocky coast that Leif names Helluland Stone Slab Land, almost certainly the southeastern coast of Baffin Island in the modern Canadian Arctic. The expedition does not find Helluland appealing, they continue south. The next landfall is a forested coast. Leif calls Markland Forest Land, most likely the coast of Labrador, with its dense conifer forests and the practical resources that the treeless Greenland settlements desperately needed. They take note of the location for future reference and continue south. The third landfall is the destination that enters history as Vinland. The widely accepted historical fact about the Norse arrival in North America is that it predated Columbus by approximately 500 years and was, until the 20th century, primarily known through the saga traditions, which had been treated by many historians as legendary rather than historical. Then, in 1960, Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Anne Stein Ingstad located the site of Lance or Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland, and the subsequent excavations confirmed, beyond any reasonable doubt, that this was a Norse settlement dating to approximately the year 1000 CE. The site contained the remains of multiple turf-walled buildings of recognizable Norse construction, iron-working evidence including the slag from a smithy where iron tools had been forged from local bog ore, personal items including a bronze pin of clearly Norse origin, and the kind of artifact assemblage that simply could not be explained by any other cultural tradition. The Vikings had reached North America. The sagas, in their essential outlines, were correct. The lesser-known detail about the Lanso Meadows site is that it appears to have functioned as a base camp rather than a permanent settlement, a winter station from which further exploration south was conducted, with crews returning to Lanso Meadows for repairs, supplies, and the relative comfort of established buildings. The actual Vinland of the sagas, with its grapes and self-sown wheat and the temperate climate that astonished the Greenland-acclimated Norse, was probably further south, perhaps along the coasts of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, or even further down toward New England, where the climate would have supported the kind of vegetation the sagas describe, and where wild grapes could plausibly have grown. Lance Oak Meadows was the staging point. Vinland itself was the broader region the Norse explored from there. You step ashore at the Lance or Meadows site, and the most striking thing about it is how thoroughly Norse it feels. The buildings are turf-walled longhouses of the same basic design as the structures back in Greenland and Iceland, the same internal organisation, the same hearths, the same sleeping platforms, the same construction techniques applied to materials available in this new environment. The smithy is producing iron tools from local bog ore. Someone is repairing a sail. 2 men are processing the carcass of a deer they took from the woods earlier in the day. The activities of the camp are recognizably the activities of a Norse settlement transplanted across an ocean and dropped onto a new continent, with no apparent disorientation about how to organize daily life in entirely new geographic circumstances. The settlement does not last. Within perhaps a few years, perhaps a decade or two, the Norse abandon their North American operations and return permanently to Greenland. The sagas attribute this to conflict with the indigenous populations of the region, the people the Norse called Skraelings, who appear in the sagas as initially curious about the Norse and increasingly hostile as the implications of the stranger's presence became clearer. The Norse, despite their military reputation, were operating at the absolute end of their logistical reach, with reinforcement essentially impossible and supplies dependent on long ocean voyages that could only be made in particular seasons. They were outnumbered by populations that had occupied this land for thousands of years and that were not interested in surrendering territory to small groups of strangers from across the water. The math did not favour continued occupation. Historians still wonder about the precise reasons for the Norse withdrawal from North America, and about the equally interesting question of why the discovery did not produce a sustained pattern of further exploration and settlement. The Greenland colonies maintained occasional contact with the Markland coast for several centuries. They continued to sail there for timber, which the treeless Greenland environment could not produce, but the impulse toward establishing permanent North American settlements appears to have died with the original Vinland attempts. Whether this was due to the practical difficulties demonstrated by the early expeditions, the loss of institutional knowledge as generations passed, the changing economic conditions in the broader Norse world, or simply the absence of a compelling reason to continue trying, is one of those historical questions where multiple plausible explanations probably each contribute partial answers. The Lance Oaks Meadows site is abandoned. The buildings are left standing. The Norse did not destroy what they had built, simply walked away from it, and over the following centuries the turf walls slowly collapse, the roofs fall in, and the site sinks back into the landscape until it is essentially invisible, waiting 900 years for 2 Norwegian researchers to find it again. Leif returns to Greenland. The continent he visited stays continental, indifferent, and will not see Europeans again for half a millennium. Leif goes home to Greenland, and the buildings at Lanceau Meadows settle quietly into the Newfoundland turf, and across the entire span of the Norse world, other Vikings are conducting their own expansion in entirely different directions, with entirely different methods, and with consequences that will outlast the brief Western experiment by approximately 1,000 years. While the Norwegians and Icelanders are pushing west into the empty Atlantic, the Swedes are pushing east into the populated heart of the Eurasian continent. And the cities and political structures they establish along the way are going to leave a mark on the map of Europe that is still visible today. You are now in a different part of the Viking world entirely. On a flat-bottomed riverboat in the early 9th century, moving up a wide, slow river through dense forest under a pale northern sky. The boat is shallower and more manoeuvrable than the longships of the Atlantic voyages built for river navigation, capable of being portaged overland between river systems when the geography demands it, and the men aboard are Swedish Vikings, who in the historical sources are called by a specific name, the Rus. The widely accepted historical fact about the Rus is that they were Scandinavian, almost certainly Swedish in origin, and that they established trading and political networks throughout the river systems of Eastern Europe between the 9th and 11th centuries. The name Rus appears in multiple contemporary sources, Byzantine, Arab, Frankish, referring consistently to a people who arrived from the north, operated along the great rivers, conducted long-distance trade with the Islamic and Byzantine worlds, and gradually established political structures over the predominantly Slavic populations of the region. The cities they founded or developed, Novgorod, Kiev, Smolensk, and others, would eventually form the foundation of the medieval state called Kievan Rus, from which the modern names Russia, Belarus, and Ruthenia are all linguistically descended. The Vikings, in other words, gave their name to one of the largest countries on earth, which is the kind of historical legacy that does not require any further amplification. The river you are travelling on now is probably the Volkhov, leading from the Baltic toward Lake Ilmen and the trading centre of Novgorod, which the Rus call Holmgard. Beyond Novgorod, the route continues south by a combination of rivers and overland portages, the boats dragged across the watersheds between river systems on log rollers, with the crews providing the muscle and the local Slavic populations sometimes providing assistance in exchange for trade goods or payment, eventually reaching the Dnieper River and the long descent toward the Black Sea. From the Black Sea, the great prize is reachable. Constantinople, the wealthiest city in the medieval world, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the place where everything desirable could be bought, sold, or stolen if circumstances permitted. The trip from the Baltic to Constantinople is approximately 2,000 kilometers and takes most of a summer, and the Vikings who completed it routinely did so as a recognized commercial activity. The route was so well established that it had a name in Old Norse Ostravega, the Eastern Way, and it generated such consistent traffic that the Byzantine emperors eventually employed Norse warriors as the elite Varangian Guard, the imperial bodyguard whose members were drawn from Scandinavia, including in later centuries from the Anglo-Saxon refugees who fled England after the Norman conquest. Harold Hardrada, who will become King of Norway and die at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 inches, one of the symbolic closing events of the Viking Age, served in the Varangian Guard as a young man and accumulated a reputation across the Mediterranean as a Norse warrior of considerable competence and even more considerable ambition. The lesser-known detail about the Rus voyages that consistently surprises people is the contemporary description provided by an Arab traveller named Ibn Fadlan, who encountered a group of Rus traders on the Volga River in 921 CE and wrote a detailed account of his observations. Ibn Fadlan was a diplomat from Baghdad sent to deliver a message to the king of the Volga Bulgars, and his report includes one of the most vivid surviving descriptions of Viking Age people written by an outside observer. He describes the Rus as physically impressive, tall, blonde, heavily tattooed, with dark blue or green designs, covering them from fingernails to neck, and as engaged in extensive trade in furs and slaves. He also describes a Rus ship burial in disturbing and meticulous detail, including the sacrifice of a slave woman who volunteered to accompany her chief into death, the construction of the funeral pyre on the ship itself, and the ritual that accompanied the burning. Ibn Fadlan's account is one of the most important external documentary sources for Viking Age society, and it captures details particularly about Rus religious practice and burial ritual that the Norse sources themselves do not preserve with the same immediacy. You arrive at the gates of Constantinople in late summer, and the city is, by the available evidence, the most overwhelming visual experience available to a medieval European traveller. The walls built and rebuilt over centuries, some of them dating from the time of Theodosius II in the 5th century, stretch in massive concentric rings, the largest fortifications anywhere in the medieval world, defending a city of perhaps 500,000 people at a time when most European cities housed populations in the low thousands. The harbours are crowded with ships from every major port of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. The markets contain goods from China, India, Persia, Africa, and every part of Europe. The Hagia Sophia rises above the rooftops, its enormous dome visible from miles out at sea, the largest enclosed interior space in the world at the time of its construction in the 6th century, and still, in the 11th, an architectural achievement that nothing in northern Europe approached. The Vikings call Constantinople Miklagard, the Great City, and the name is not exaggeration. The trading station the Rus maintain in the city is one of the most important commercial relationships in the Norse economic world, exchanging Russian and Scandinavian furs, slaves, and amber for the silks, spices, wines, fine textiles, and silver coinage of the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. The silver flows north through the river systems back to Scandinavia in the quantities that show up in the archaeological hoards centuries later, and the cultural exchange flows in both directions, leaving Byzantine influences on Scandinavian art and Christian missionary connections that will eventually transform Norse religion entirely. Historians still wonder about the precise relationship between the Scandinavian Rus and the Slavic populations they ruled, specifically the degree to which the Rus political elite remained ethnically distinct from their subjects, or assimilated into the broader Slavic culture they governed. The evidence suggests rapid cultural assimilation. By the 11th century, the descendants of the original Scandinavian Rus were speaking Slavic languages, adopting Slavic names, intermarrying with the local population, and functioning as a Slavic-speaking ruling class with Scandinavian ancestry rather than as a distinct ethnic community. The Russia that emerged from this process was Slavic in language and culture, but bore the name and the political institutions of its Scandinavian founders. The boat returns north in autumn before the rivers freeze. The silver is loaded carefully into chests that will eventually find their way back to Sweden. The men aboard, who have spent a summer reaching the gates of the world's greatest city and conducting business with merchants from 3 continents, will be home for the winter and out again the following spring. The Eastern Way is open. The Vikings know how to use it. The boats come home and the silver settles into Scandinavian hoards, and the Eastern Way carries its cargo for another season and another and another. But somewhere in the long summers of all those river journeys and ocean crossings, something quieter is happening that will, in the end, transform the Viking world more thoroughly than any battle or any voyage. The Vikings are meeting Christians. They are trading with them, raiding them, settling among them, marrying their daughters, hiring themselves out as warriors to their kings, and listening sometimes attentively, sometimes politely, sometimes with the strategic interest of people who understand that conversion to the religion of your most important trading partners has practical advantages to the priests and missionaries who keep insisting that there is, in fact, only one God, that he has very specific opinions about what they have been doing, and that the arrangement with Odin and Thor and the rest is not going to end well. The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity is one of the most gradual and uneven religious transformations in European history, and that gradualness is part of what makes it interesting tonight. There is no single moment when Scandinavia became Christian. There are decades, generations, in some places of mixed practice, syncretism, individual conversions, royal proclamations, followed by partial compliance, and the slow social and economic pressure of a continental Christianity that controlled increasing amounts of the wealth and power of medieval Europe. The conversion happens in waves, in pieces, with significant regional variation, and with periods of pagan revival that complicate any simple narrative of inevitable progress toward the new religion. You are now at a Christian missionary's wooden chapel somewhere in southern Denmark in the late 9th century, and the building is small, dim, and notably less impressive than the pagan temple located several kilometers away in the same valley. The missionary is Frankish, sent from the great Christian centers of Central Europe by clerical authorities who consider the conversion of the heathen north a religious obligation and an organizational priority. He has been here for several years, His Old Norse is functional but accented. He has converted a handful of local families, primarily merchants, whose trade with Christian Europe creates practical incentives for conversion. And he is patient, because the people who sent him understand that this is going to take time. The widely accepted historical fact about the conversion of Scandinavia is that it was driven significantly from the top down by kings who chose Christianity for a combination of personal, political, and economic reasons, and then imposed it, with varying degrees of force and patience, on populations that did not necessarily share their enthusiasm. Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, yes, the man whose nickname is now attached to the wireless technology that connects your phone to your car, by way of an entertaining marketing decision, in the 1990s, converted to Christianity around 965 CE, and famously commemorated the achievement on the Jelling Stone, an enormous carved monument that he claimed had made the Danes Christian. Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, ruling at the end of the 10th century, prosecuted the conversion of Norway with considerable energy and considerably less patience, using methods that ranged from missionary preaching to direct violence against pagan holdouts. Olaf Haraldsson, ruling Norway in the early 11th century, completed what Tryggvason had started and was eventually canonized as Saint Olaf for his trouble, despite a personality that contemporary sources suggest was not conventionally saintly. The lesser-known detail about Scandinavian conversion that consistently surprises people is the degree of religious syncretism that characterized the transition. Archaeological evidence from this period includes objects that combine Christian and pagan symbolism in ways that would be considered theologically incompatible by either purely Christian or purely pagan standards. Small moulded amulets that appear to be either crosses or Thor's hammers, depending on how you turn them. Burial assemblages that include both Christian crosses and traditional pagan grave goods. Runestones that begin with Christian invocations and end with pagan formulas. The transition was not an abrupt switch between two completely separate systems. It was a slow process of negotiation, in which individuals and communities worked out their own accommodations between the old beliefs and the new, often holding both simultaneously for generations before the older traditions finally faded into folk practice and eventually into folklore. You watch a baptism at the wooden chapel, a Norse family, the father and mother and 3 children, being baptized together by the Frankish missionary in a small font of carved wood. The ceremony is conducted in Latin, which none of the family understands, but they go through the motions correctly because they have been instructed in what to do. Afterward, the missionary blesses each of them individually and presents the father with a small silver cross on a leather cord. The father puts it around his neck, where it joins, and this is the detail that says everything about this period, a Thor's hammer pendant that he is also wearing and clearly does not see any reason to remove. The missionary notices but says nothing. This particular battle will be fought another day by another generation. For now, the family has been baptized. The hammer can wait. The conversion process is uneven across the Scandinavian regions. Denmark Christianizes earliest and most thoroughly, partly due to its proximity to the Frankish kingdoms and the resulting density of missionary activity, partly due to the political ambitions of its rulers. Norway follows, more slowly and with more friction. Sweden Christianizes last and least completely the great pagan temple at Uppsala, with its triple statue of Odin, Thor and Freya, continues operating into the late 11th century, and Christian missionaries report active pagan practice in parts of Sweden as late as the 12th century. Iceland's conversion, by contrast, is one of the most distinctive in Christian history. In the year 1000 CE, the Icelandic Althing, faced with the prospect of religious civil war between the Christian and pagan factions of Icelandic society, debated the question for several days and then collectively decided to convert to Christianity with the legal compromise that pagans could continue to practice their traditional rites in private. The decision was made by formal political vote, recorded in the saga literature, and provides one of the few examples in history of a society democratically choosing its religion. Historians still wonder about the lived religious experience of ordinary Scandinavians during the conversion period particularly. The question of how genuinely the new religion was internalized at the popular level, as opposed to being adopted as a matter of legal and political compliance. The textual sources are written almost entirely from the Christian perspective, and they tend to describe successful conversions in terms that may not accurately reflect the actual religious sensibilities of the people involved. Folk practices, popular beliefs, and the persistence of pagan motifs in Scandinavian culture for centuries after official Christianization all suggest that the formal conversion was the beginning, rather than the end, of a much longer process of religious transformation. The wooden chapels of the early conversion era are eventually replaced by stone churches, often built directly on the sites of former pagan temples, a practice that was simultaneously theological and practical, claiming the sacred geography of the old religion for the new while making efficient use of established gathering places. Some of these stone churches still stand in Scandinavia today, their foundations resting on layers of earlier religious activity that the modern visitor cannot see, but that the medieval builders knew about and chose deliberately to preserve. The hammer and the cross, side by side around the same neck, will eventually become only the cross, but it takes a long time. The hammer fades and the cross persists, and the slow religious transformation of Scandinavia produces, over the course of the 10th and early 11th centuries, a new kind of Norse ruler, one who can speak fluently to the Christian courts of continental Europe, who can correspond with popes and conduct diplomacy in the language of Latin Christendom, and who can also, when the situation calls for it, lead a fleet of longships across the North Sea with the same competence and the same ruthlessness as his pagan grandfathers. The Vikings have not stopped being Vikings. They have simply added Christianity to the toolkit, and the resulting fusion produces, in the early 11th century, the largest and most ambitious political project the Viking Age will ever generate. His name is Knut, and he is going to build an empire. You are now in southern England in the autumn of 1016 CE, and the political situation you have walked into is the kind of situation that medieval English chroniclers tended to summarize with phrases like, "And there was great calamity in the land," which was their professional shorthand for very specific events that they did not have the energy to describe in detail. The English King Ethelred, known to history as Ethelred the Unready, a nickname that derives not from a lack of preparation but from the Old English unrad, meaning ill-counselled, which is a more accurate but less catchy diagnosis, has spent his reign paying enormous tributes to Viking raiders, organising periodic counterattacks that achieved mixed results, and presiding over a kingdom whose Anglo-Saxon institutions are increasingly strained by the demands of constant Scandinavian pressure. Ethelred dies in April 1016. His son Edmund Ironside fights a brilliant defensive campaign against the Viking forces of the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard's son Knut. Edmund Ironside dies in November 1016, possibly from natural causes, possibly not. Knut is suddenly the King of England. He is 21 years old. The widely accepted historical fact about Knut is that he proved to be one of the most effective rulers of the early 11th century anywhere in Europe, and that his subsequent achievements were considerably more impressive than the circumstances of his accession to the English throne would have predicted. Within a few years of taking England, Knut also secured the throne of Denmark following his elder brother's death, and shortly afterward he added Norway to his collection through a combination of military pressure, political manoeuvring, and the strategic deployment of subordinates who could be trusted to govern in his name. By the early 1030s, Knut ruled an empire encompassing England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden, what historians now call the North Sea Empire, a political entity that briefly turned the entire North Sea into something approaching a Scandinavian lake. The empire was not just a collection of conquered territories held by force. Knut governed England with what contemporaries described as exceptional competence and visible commitment to the welfare of his English subjects. He confirmed and extended the existing English legal traditions rather than imposing Danish law. He patronized English churches and monasteries with substantial donations. He retained the existing Anglo-Saxon administrative structures, working through the same ealdormen and bishops and royal officials who had served his predecessors. And he made significant efforts to present himself as a legitimate English king rather than as a foreign occupier. He married Ethelred's widow, Emma of Normandy, a political marriage that simultaneously consolidated his claim to the English throne and produced an alliance with Normandy whose long-term consequences neither party could have foreseen, and the resulting court combined Anglo-Saxon, Danish, and Norman influences in a cultural fusion that shaped the late Anglo-Saxon period in distinctive ways. The lesser-known detail about Knut that consistently surprises people is the famous incident of the tide. The popular version of this story, Knut commanding the sea to retreat and then being humiliated when it does not obey, is exactly backwards from the original. The medieval account, recorded by the chronicler Henry of Huntingdon, presents the incident as a deliberate piece of political theatre by Knut himself. Surrounded by courtiers who flattered him as the most powerful king in the world, Knut commanded that his throne be carried to the seashore, sat down before the incoming tide, and ordered the sea to halt its advance. When the water continued to rise, as Knut knew perfectly well it would, he turned to his courtiers and said something to the effect of, "See how limited the power of even the greatest king is, compared to the power of God." The story is recorded as a demonstration of Knut's piety and political wisdom, not his foolishness. He was making a point about the limits of royal authority, and he was making it in a way calculated to remind everyone present that there was in fact a higher power than the king. This is a sophisticated piece of public messaging from a ruler who clearly understood the medium of political performance. You are at Knut's court at Winchester in the late 1020s, and the atmosphere is genuinely cosmopolitan in a way that few Northern European courts of the period managed to achieve. There are English nobles and Danish warriors and Norwegian advisors and Norman clerics, and they are speaking a mixture of Old English, Old Norse and Latin, with various combinations of bilingualism and translation managing the linguistic complexity. The court is wealthy, well-fed, and projecting the kind of confident continental sophistication that Knut clearly believed was appropriate for a king of his rank. Foreign embassies arrive regularly. Knut has made a famous pilgrimage to Rome in 1027 to attend the coronation of the German emperor, conducted diplomacy with the Pope, and returned with confirmed papal recognition of his royal status. He is, by any measure available to the 11th century, one of the most important rulers in Europe. Then he dies. In November 1035, at approximately 40 years old, Knut dies, possibly from natural causes, possibly from the accumulated wear of 2 decades of relentless political activity and the North Sea Empire, which had depended entirely on his personal capacity to hold its disparate territories together, immediately begins to fracture. His sons, who lacked their father's combination of strategic patience, administrative competence, and sheer political talent, prove unable to maintain the integrated empire. Within a few years, England, Denmark, and Norway are again separate kingdoms with separate rulers, and the brief moment when the North Sea was a single political space has ended. Historians still wonder about the long-term implications of the North Sea Empire if Knut had lived longer, or if his successors had inherited more of his abilities. The integration of England, Denmark, and Norway into a single political unit would have produced a fundamentally different European political landscape, perhaps preventing the Norman conquest of England, perhaps establishing a Scandinavian-led Northern European political bloc that would have rivaled the German Empire and the French kingdom for centuries. The empire's collapse after Knut's death is one of the great what-if moments of medieval history, and the actual political trajectory of subsequent centuries was significantly shaped by the empire's failure to outlast its founder. The Anglo-Saxon throne returns to the line of Ethelred, the Unready, in the person of his son Edward, known to history as Edward the Confessor, who has spent his exile in Normandy, and who returns to England with a Norman cultural orientation that will, eventually, to contribute to the events of 1066 inches, ways that will close the Viking Age with the same dramatic decisiveness with which it began. But that is still a generation away. For now, England is English again, and Scandinavia is Scandinavian, and the brief Viking Empire is over. The Viking Empire is over, and the brief experiment in North Sea integration fades back into the separate national identities it had temporarily contained, and the various kingdoms of the Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon worlds get on with their separate trajectories, with the slightly unsettled energy of political entities that have just been reminded how rapidly the map can change. The decades after Knut's death are filled with the usual succession disputes, regional conflicts, and dynastic complications that constitute the normal background noise of medieval European politics. And through these complications, the position of England remains particularly unsettled, because Edward the Confessor, who takes the English throne in 1042, is a king without children, a situation that medieval monarchies generally found uncomfortable for predictable reasons. Edward dies in January 1066 without leaving a clear heir, and the resulting succession crisis attracts the attention of three distinct claimants, each with arguments that range from genuinely compelling to creatively interpreted. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful English noble, is acclaimed king by the Anglo-Saxon Witan, the Council of Leading Nobles, and crowned the day after Edward's death. William, Duke of Normandy, claims that Edward had promised him the throne years earlier and that Harold himself had sworn an oath to support that claim. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, claims the throne through a complicated chain of inheritance arguments, going back to a treaty made between his predecessor Magnus the Good and Knut's son Harthacnut decades earlier. The arguments do not need to be evaluated tonight on their legal merits. What matters is that three armed forces are converging on England in the autumn of 1066 with three different intentions, and the year is going to end very differently from how it began. Harald Hardrada arrives first. You are now in northern England in late September 1066, and the Norwegian king, who has spent his life accumulating military experience from the Varangian Guard in Constantinople to the throne of Norway, has landed in Yorkshire with an army of approximately 10,000 warriors and the firm intention of taking the English crown by force. He has been joined by Tostig Godwinson, the estranged brother of King Harold of England, who is providing local political legitimacy and intelligence about the English defensive arrangements. The combined force defeats an English northern army at the Battle of Fulford on September 20, captures York, and settles in to consolidate the conquest with the comfortable confidence of an experienced military operation that believes the hard work is already done. The widely accepted historical fact about what happens next is that King Harold of England, who is in the south of England preparing to repel the expected Norman invasion under William, receives news of Hardrada's landing and conducts one of the most remarkable forced marches in medieval military history, moving his army approximately 200 miles north in less than a week. arriving at the bridge over the River Derwent at Stamford on September 25, with an exhausted but combat-ready force that the Norwegians did not believe could possibly be there yet. The Battle of Stamford Bridge that follows is one of the decisive engagements of the 11th century. Harald Hardrada is killed. Tostig is killed. The Norwegian army is destroyed so thoroughly that, according to the chronicles, the Norwegian survivors required only 24 ships to carry them home, out of the more than 300 that had brought them to England. The defeat is total. The Norwegian threat to England ends permanently. The Viking Age, in any meaningful military sense, ends here on a small bridge in Yorkshire, on a clear September afternoon. The lesser-known detail about Stamford Bridge that consistently captures the imagination is the legend of the lone Viking warrior on the bridge, a single Norse axeman who, according to the chronicles, held the narrow bridge alone against the entire English army for hours, killing dozens of attackers and preventing the English from crossing, while the Norwegian army, on the far side, desperately tried to organise a defensive position. The man was reportedly killed only when an Englishman floated under the bridge in a small barrel and stabbed him from below, a detail that probably belongs more to legend than to history, but that captures something essential about the cultural memory of the Viking Age. The image of a single warrior whose individual valour temporarily holds back the inevitable conclusion. Whether the lone axeman existed or not, his story belongs in any honest account of how the Viking Age ended, because the Viking Age ended in exactly the form the legend describes, with a single Norwegian warrior, alone on a bridge, holding the line against overwhelming force, until the overwhelming force found a way around him. Then, 3 days later, William of Normandy lands at Pevensey on the south coast of England. Harold marches south. The Battle of Hastings on October 14 is the more famous of 1066's, two great battles, and the result is the more famous transformation. The Norman conquest of England, the death of King Harold, the coronation of William the Conqueror in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066, the imposition of Norman French as the language of the English aristocracy, the construction of the Norman castles and cathedrals that reshaped the English landscape, the wholesale transformation of English society over the subsequent decades into something that fused Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian, and Norman elements into the medieval English nation that would emerge in the centuries to follow. All of this is true and important and well known, but the Normans themselves were Vikings. The historical detail that completes the closing of the Viking Age is that the Normans of 1066 were the descendants of Viking, settlers who had been granted territory in northern France, approximately a century and a half earlier, the Norse warriors, led by Rollo, who had been ceded the region that would become Normandy in 911 CE, in exchange for ending their raids and accepting Frankish overlordship. Within a few generations, these Vikings had assimilated thoroughly into French language and culture, becoming Norman in the cultural sense, while retaining their Norse military traditions and their characteristic Viking willingness to organize ambitious overseas military expeditions whenever opportunities presented themselves. The Norman invasion of England in 1066 was, in a very real sense, a Viking invasion, conducted by Vikings who no longer thought of themselves as Vikings, against an England that had been profoundly shaped by previous Viking invasions, leading to a political settlement that integrated all of these Scandinavian-derived elements into the new medieval kingdom. Historians still wonder about the precise relationship between Stamford Bridge and Hastings. Specifically, the question of whether Harold's exhausted army would have defeated William at Hastings if it had not been forced to march 200 miles north and fight a major battle just 3 weeks earlier. The counterfactual is interesting but ultimately unanswerable. What is clear is that 1066 represents one of the most consequential single years in European history, that 2 of its 3 battles directly involved Scandinavian forces, and that the political settlement that emerged from it ended one phase of European history and began another. You stand on the field of Hastings in the gathering dusk of the 14th of October, 1066, and the Viking Age, 3 centuries of longships and raids and settlements and trade and conversion and empire is, with a quiet finality that feels almost gentle after everything that came before, over. The longships will sail again, occasionally, for specific purposes. But the world has moved on. The world has moved on. And the field at Hastings settles into the long quiet that battlefields settle into after the noise stops, and the men who fought there, the survivors and the dead, the conquerors and the conquered, pass into the historical record, and from there into legend, and from there into the gradually fading background hum of the medieval centuries that follow. The Viking Age does not end with a single ceremony or a formal proclamation. It ends the way ages tend to end, with the people who made it themselves becoming something else, blending into the populations they had previously raided or settled among, until the distinction between Viking and not Viking becomes a question of historical perspective rather than lived identity. By the end of the 11th century, the people who would once have been called Vikings are simply Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, Icelanders, Normans, English, Scots, Irish, and Russians, Europeans of various national identities, distinguishable from each other by language and political loyalty, rather than by any shared sense of being part of a single Scandinavian phenomenon. You are now back where this journey began, or not exactly back, because nothing is ever exactly back, but standing once again at the edge of a quiet Norwegian fjord, with the same pine forests rising on the slopes, and the same cold blue water, moving with the same slow patience, and the same pale northern light, filtering through the same thin, overcast sky. The longships are gone. The pre-Viking world that you stood in at the beginning of tonight is not the world you stand in now. 11 centuries have passed in the geographical sense. This fjord has endured another 1,000 years of weathering, of forest succession, of small geological adjustments, but the essential character of the landscape is unchanged, and the silence that you noticed at the very start is still here, still present. Still, the deep ambient stillness of a northern landscape with very few human voices in it. The Viking Age left a great deal behind, and tonight, before sleep, it is worth taking a quiet inventory of what survived. The widely accepted historical fact about the Viking legacy is that it permeates modern European culture in ways that often go unrecognized in daily life. The English language carries hundreds of words borrowed from Old Norse during the Anglo-Scandinavian period of the Danelaw, and many of these are among the most basic and frequently used words in modern English. They, them, their, sky, window, knife, leg, husband, egg, give, take, get, want, die, happy. The personal pronouns themselves, the most fundamental machinery of English grammar, were borrowed from Old Norse during this period, replacing earlier Anglo-Saxon forms. Every English speaker uses Viking vocabulary every day without noticing, because the borrowing was so thorough and so early that the Norse origins are no longer visible at the surface. The geography of northern England is dotted with place names whose Norse origins are obvious to anyone who knows what to do. Look for settlements ending in by indicate Viking-era farms or villages, Whitby, Grimsby, Derby, Selby, hundreds of others. The ending, Thorpe, marks a smaller subsidiary settlement. The ending, Thwaite, indicates a clearing. The word fell for a hill, the word beck for a stream, the word dale for a valley. All of these are Norse words that became part of the English landscape vocabulary, particularly in the regions of historically densest Viking settlement. The map of northern England, read with the right linguistic key, is in many ways a map of Viking Age settlement patterns preserved unchanged through a millennium of subsequent history. The lesser-known detail about the Viking legacy that consistently surprises people is the genetic evidence. Modern genetic studies of populations across the historical Viking world have shown significant Norse genetic contributions in many regions, not just in Iceland and the Faroes, where the Norse origins are explicit, but in significant proportions of the population in northern England, parts of Scotland, the Northern Isles, Eastern Ireland, and northern France. The Vikings did not just raid and leave. They settled, intermarried, had children, and contributed permanent genetic contributions to the populations of the regions they reached. The descendants of Vikings number in the millions today, distributed across populations who do not necessarily think of themselves as Scandinavian descended, but who carry the genetic markers of the Viking expansion in proportions that are sometimes substantial. You sit down on a low rock at the edge of the fjord and look out across the water. The afternoon light is starting its slow descent toward evening, the long, gradual dimming that northern latitudes produce in the evenings of summer, when the sun does not so much set as gradually decline over the course of hours, the sky shifting through pale blue to grey to pink to the deep indigo of full dark. The air is cool. A breeze comes down the fjord from the open sea, smelling of salt and pine, the same combination of smells that filled this place in 750 CE and 950 CE and 1150 CE, and that fills it now. The geography does not care about the historical periods we use to organize the past. The geography simply persists, accommodating whatever human activity happens to be using it at any given moment, indifferent to the names and the dates and the ages. The sagas survived. The Eddas survived. The runestones survived in the thousands, scattered across Scandinavia with their carved memorial inscriptions to Viking Age individuals, a husband who died abroad, a son lost at sea, a brother who fell in some specific named battle. The Oseberg ship survived, buried in a Norwegian grave mound and excavated in 1904, providing one of the most complete examples of Viking Age ship construction. The Lewis chessmen survived, 12th century carved walrus ivory pieces, showing Norse warriors with shields and helmets and beards, and the particular wide-eyed expression that has charmed museum visitors for over a century. The Lansor Meadows site survived, sleeping under Newfoundland turf for 900 years until two researchers found it again. The institutional Althing survived, in modified form, into the modern Icelandic parliament. The languages survived. Modern Icelandic is still close enough to Old Norse that contemporary Icelanders can read the medieval sagas with relatively little assistance, while modern Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish carry more substantial linguistic distance from their Viking Age ancestor, but remain recognizably descended from it. Historians still wonder about the long-term cultural and political consequences of the Viking Age, particularly the question of how much of subsequent European development was shaped by Viking activity in ways that are not always explicitly acknowledged. The political integration of England as a single kingdom owes significant debt to the Anglo-Saxon resistance to Viking pressure. The medieval Russian state grew directly from Viking foundations. The cultural and economic networks of the North Atlantic world were established by Viking voyages. The European awareness of distant geography, the existence of lands across the Western Ocean, the connection between Northern Europe and the Mediterranean and Islamic worlds through eastern river systems was substantially shaped by the Viking expansion. Subtract the Vikings from the European story, and a great deal of what came afterward becomes very difficult to explain. The fjord goes quiet. The seabirds settle into their evening positions. Somewhere in the distance, a single voice, perhaps a fisherman, perhaps a farmer, calling to a dog, drifts down across the water and then fades. The pine forests on the slopes catch the last of the daylight in their needles, holding it briefly, releasing it slowly into the gathering dusk. The Viking Age is over. The fjord remains. The water still smells of salt and pine, and somewhere underneath all of it, the long inheritance of 3 centuries of Northmen still moves through the modern world in the words people use to describe the sky, in the boats their descendants build, in the genes carried in millions of bodies across half the globe, in the stories that still get told around fires and screens about gods and giants and longships pulling away from gravel beaches into the rising mist of 1,000-year-old morning. And now, with all of that gently behind you, the longships and the law codes, the gods that lived in the sky and the women at the looms, the journeys west to lands that no European had yet imagined, and the journeys east to cities older than memory, you can let the whole great map of it soften and blur, the way distant landscapes soften and blur when seen from a window late in the day, when nothing more is required of you than simply being where you are. There is nothing left to remember tonight. The history will still be there in the morning, kept safe in books and museums and the quiet earth itself, and you do not need to carry any of it with you into sleep. You only need to let yourself rest. Imagine, if you like, a small wooden boat tied loosely to a wooden post at the edge of a quiet fjord, the water beneath it dark and unhurried, the boat moving gently with the slow rhythm of small waves you cannot quite see. The sky above is the deep, soft indigo of the long northern twilight, and there is no wind to speak of, only the faintest breath of cool air carrying the smell of pine and salt and something sweet from a meadow further inland. There is no one waiting for you. There is nothing you need to do. The boat is simply there, the water is simply there, and the night is settling into its own slow business of arriving. Your breathing is slow, your body is heavy, the lights are low. The world is taking care of itself, as it always does, and you are exactly where you need to be. Sleep gently, traveller. The fjord is still there. It will be there in the morning.